The Greek realm of the dead is older, colder, and far more intricate than most people realise. It's a place of shadows and silence, of judges and endless rivers, where heroes and villains, and everyone in between, eventually find themselves. And not always forever. If this kind of storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting drifting off together, even if tonight we're heading into the afterlife. So, close your eyes, let the day fade, and let's begin with the entire story of the Underworld. Imagine, if you will, that death in ancient Greece was less about harps and halos, and more about paperwork and a very long walk. Welcome to the Underworld. Not quite hell, not quite heaven, and certainly not the place you stumbled into uninvited. This was no vague afterlife, but a fully formed terrain, complete with rivers, gates, judges, and the sort of ambience that would make even the most persistent travel agent hesitate. The Greeks didn't imagine the afterlife as something celestial. Floating upward was more of a later innovation. No, to the ancient Greek, death was a descent. The underworld, or Hades, was believed to lie beneath the earth, a vast echoing domain where the dead, regardless of virtue or vice, ended up. There were exceptions, of course. We'll get to those who earned upgrades or demotions later. But the standard model was simple. When you die, you go down. This idea of downward is worth noting. In Greek cosmology, the universe was a tiered thing. Olympus sat high atop Mount Olympus. The mortal world spread in the middle. And beneath it all, the underworld waited like a shadow. It wasn't a place of torment per se, at least not for most, but it was no one's idea of a retirement plan either. The name Hades referred both to the realm and to its king, an occasionally confusing naming convention, like calling your flat Philip, and then inviting Philip round for tea. The realm of Hades, though, was vast and complex. To map it is to understand the Greeks' deepest fears, beliefs, and, on occasion, grim sense of humour. The journey to Hades began with death, naturally. Hermes, ever the multi-talented god, served as psychopomp, a role that sounds like a Victorian insult, but actually means soul guide. It was Hermes who gently ushered the newly dead from the world of the living to the threshold of the underworld. And here, at the gates, stood the 5 rivers, the first and perhaps most poetic boundaries of the land of the dead. Each river in the underworld had a purpose and a personality, and none of them particularly friendly. Acheron, the river of woe, was the main entrance, a sorrowful torrent that the souls of the dead had to cross. It wasn't exactly inviting. Think more eternal sighing than babbling brook. Styx, the most famous of the 5, was the river of hatred. It wound its way through the underworld, forming a sort of ghostly moat around the palace of Hades himself. The gods, interestingly, swore their most sacred oaths by Styx. If one broke such an oath, they were forced to lie breathless for a year. The Greeks took promises and rivers very seriously. Phlegethon, the river of fire, flowed like molten lava through Tartarus, the realm's bleakest depths. Not a river to picnic beside, unless you like your olives flambé. Cocytus, the river of lamentation, echoed with the cries of the damned. It had an excellent echo, which presumably made things worse. And then there was Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, offering a forgetfulness so complete that even sorrow vanished. A sip, and you'd forget your life, yourself, and your past. Later mystery religions, like those of the Orphics, encouraged drinking from Mnemosyne, the river of memory, instead. Assuming you could find it, of course. These rivers weren't meant to be navigated. They were metaphysical boundaries, symbolizing emotions and transitions of the soul. They formed a kind of topographical poetry. A soul passed from grief to hatred, from fire to forgetfulness, on the journey to its final rest. To cross the Acheron, one required the services of Charon, a dour old man who piloted the ferry of the dead. Charon did not work for free. He expected payment in the form of an obol, a small coin traditionally placed under the tongue or on the eyes of the deceased during burial. Those without payment were left stranded, wandering the riverbank for eternity, like unfortunate backpackers who forgot to book accommodation. This tradition gave rise to one of the most enduring funeral customs in ancient Greece. Coins in the mouth were not merely symbolic, they were logistical. One did not want to risk ending up stuck beside Charon with nothing but regret and a dry mouth. Once across the river, a soul would pass by Cerberus, the fearsome three-headed dog who guarded the gates. Unlike modern dogs, Cerberus was not interested in belly rubs. His job was to keep souls in, not out. He was, in effect, the Underworld's answer to airport security, though far less likely to misplace your luggage. Cerberus rarely caused trouble, except when Heracles dragged him out during one of his labours, and when Orpheus lulled him to sleep with music. That's the sort of workplace chaos even Hades didn't enjoy, a bit like having a dragon as a receptionist and finding him humming to a lyre. Once past the gate, souls were sorted, not by a divine receptionist with a clipboard, but by 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. They were former mortal kings, now given posthumous promotions to arbiters of eternal destiny. From there, souls went to one of 3 places. Asphodel Meadows was the most common destination. Souls here wandered in a grey, twilight world, stripped of memory and identity. It wasn't punishment, just boring. The Greek version of eternal mediocrity. Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, was a paradise for heroes and the especially righteous. This was the Greek reward for a life well lived. Green fields, music, and an absence of paperwork. Some believed Elysium even had its own special reincarnation cycle. The Isles of the Blessed for those who lived 3 consecutive virtuous lives. And then there was Tartarus, a prison for the wicked and rebellious. Notably, it also held divine enemies like the Titans, along with famous mythological wrongdoers. More on them later, they're quite the rogues gallery. Later philosophers, especially the Orphics and Pythagoreans, would complicate this map. They introduced ideas of reincarnation, transmigration, and the soul's journey through many lives. But the standard map remained etched in the Greek imagination. A journey downwards, a ferry ride, a judgment, and an eternity, somewhere. The Greeks, being delightfully imaginative, located several earthly entrances to the underworld. Among the most famous was Cape Tainaron in the Peloponnese, a cave by the sea said to be an actual doorway to Hades. Another was Lake Avernus in Italy, adopted by the Romans but inherited from Greek tradition. Poets and pilgrims alike treated these sites with reverence, or at least with caution. one didn't go spelunking near a gate to the afterlife. Not without Hermes on speed dial. The Greeks believed the soul, or psyche, departed the body at death, often imagined as a small winged figure. Not an angel, mind you, just a ghost with accessories. This psyche then journeyed downward through all the stages we've mentioned. Interestingly, the soul in Greek tradition wasn't necessarily immortal in a celebratory sense. It lingered, it remembered, sometimes, but it was diminished. This was not a resurrection faith. The afterlife was a shadow of life, not a glorious continuation of it. To understand the underworld is to understand Greek morality. Life was lived under the constant shadow of death, and the afterlife wasn't a reward or punishment system so much as a mirror, reflecting your deeds, but dimly. Only the truly great, the dazzlingly virtuous or heroic, made it to Elysium. Most wandered asphodel. The worst went to Tartarus. And the rest? Well, that depended on the ferry fare. So here we are, standing on the bank of the Acheron, coin in hand, a dog with too many heads watching us shuffle nervously toward the ferry. It is a strange thing, this underworld. Grim, yes, but orderly. Logical even. A place where death is not the end, but the beginning of bureaucracy. And for the ancient Greeks, it was precisely this structure, this detailed, mapped and river-crossed realm, that brought meaning to the unknown. The underworld was not chaos, it was navigation. And in that map, they found comfort. Next, we'll meet its rulers, the quiet king, Hades, and the unwilling queen, Persephone. But for now, keep your obol safe and don't pet the dog. When one pictures royalty, certain images come to mind. Golden thrones, courtiers fawning, banquet halls echoing with laughter. The underworld's rulers, however, are a rather different sort. Hades and Persephone do not throw feasts. They don't pose for coins. They reign quietly, more like librarians than monarchs. But make no mistake, theirs is a formidable kingdom, not of conquest, but of permanence. Let's begin with Hades himself, the eldest son of Cronus and Rhea. Yes, eldest, though often overshadowed by his more flamboyant brothers. Zeus got the skies, Poseidon got the sea, and Hades drew the short end, or depending on how you see it, the deepest one. He was given dominion over the land of the dead, which in ancient Greek cosmology was less of a punishment and more of a cosmic necessity. Someone had to tend the graveyard of the world. Contrary to popular interpretation, Hades wasn't evil. He was stern, yes, unforgiving, certainly, but not malevolent. He ruled with order, not cruelty. In fact, the Greeks didn't even like to say his name aloud, not because they feared him as wicked, but because they respected his solemn distance. Euphemisms were preferred. Pluton, meaning wealthy one, was a common choice. It's a clever nod to the riches of the earth, gold, silver, and the dead, all found beneath the soil. His appearance in myths is rare, and when he does emerge, he's not tossing thunderbolts or turning into animals. He appears when duty calls, when lines are crossed, or when a bride must be taken. Ah yes, Persephone. Her story, like so much in Greek mythology, is layered. On the surface, it is a tale of abduction. Hades, stricken by love, or something close to it, bursts forth from the earth, seizes Persephone as she gathers flowers, and vanishes with her into the shadows. One moment she's picking narcissus in a sunlit field, the next she's hurtling into the abyss. Naturally, her mother, the goddess Demeter, is displeased. When a goddess of agriculture is upset, she doesn't send letters. She simply stops growing things. Crops failed. The earth withered. Humanity, caught in the divine domestic quarrel, began to starve. Eventually, a compromise was brokered. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother, and part with her new husband. This seasonal arrangement became mythological shorthand for the changing of the seasons. When Persephone rises, spring returns. When she descends, the earth sleeps. But this tidy cycle masks the more disturbing undercurrents. The pomegranate, the fruit Persephone eats in the underworld, is more than a snack. By consuming it, she is bound to the realm of the dead. Some versions say she was tricked, others that she accepted the seeds willingly. Either way, the symbolism is rich. To eat of the underworld is to belong to it. The fruit is both wedding ring and chain. Now, as Queen of the Dead, Persephone becomes a dual figure, both maiden and matron, life and death. She is not merely Hades' wife. She is a sovereign in her own right, and her presence in the underworld changes it. She brings a certain grace, a balance. Where Hades governed with rules, Persephone governs with meaning. She is the mourner's comfort, the priestess's prayer, the spring within the soil. Their relationship, though born of force, evolves. Later myths portray a far more complicated, even tender, bond. Persephone is no prisoner sulking in shadows. She becomes the judge of souls, the enforcer of curses, the veiled queen before whom even the dead lower their eyes, and Hades, he is fiercely loyal. Unlike most Olympian gods, he has no dalliances, no swan-related scandals. His affection, however oddly acquired, is singular. The story of Hades and Persephone became the spiritual core of the Eleusinian mysteries, one of ancient Greece's most sacred religious rites. Held annually in the town of Eleusis, the mysteries promised initiates a deeper understanding of death and the hope, however dim, of something beyond it. The exact rituals remain, well, mysterious. The Greeks were excellent at keeping secrets when properly terrified, but we do know that the story of Demeter and Persephone lay at the heart of it, and that participants came away changed. Not immortal, but comforted. It was perhaps the first afterlife assurance plan. There's something else curious about Hades' kingdom. It is not a place of chaos, but of categories. And no category was more serious than burial. To die without it was to be condemned to wander, unable to enter the gates, unable to be judged, unable to forget. The importance of a proper burial cannot be overstated. Even criminals were sometimes afforded rites, if only to avoid haunting. The soul, left unburied, became restless, angry, sticky, one might say in terms of haunting potential. This belief gave rise to entire myths. Antigone defying the law to bury her brother, Odysseus pouring libations to summon the dead, even Achilles dragging Hector's body around Troy, not just as insult, but to deny him peace. The dead had rights and the living had duties. It was a delicate ecosystem of remembrance. And yet, despite all the gravity, the underworld was not without its bureaucracy. The judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, presided over souls like a celestial tribunal. They were not Olympian gods, but mortals rewarded with posthumous promotions. Minos, in particular, was viewed as the chief judge. A former king of Crete, now sorting shades like a mythical civil servant. Their judgments were based on life's deeds, though the criteria were flexible. Heroism helped. So did piety. Excessive hubris, on the other hand, tended to result in more unpleasant accommodations. Still, most people didn't land in Tartarus, That was reserved for the worst offenders, oath breakers, kinslayers, and those who really annoyed the gods. The rest, as we've said, shuffled quietly off to the asphodel meadows, where they wandered like half-remembered dreams. But it is in Hades and Persephone's duality that we glimpse something timeless. They are not light and dark, but stillness and return. Hades is the final silence, Persephone the whisper that breaks it. He holds the keys. She walks between worlds. Their reign is not built on thunder or glory, but inevitability. And in Greek thought, there is something sacred about inevitability. The underworld was not feared because it was monstrous. It was feared because it was permanent. It was fair, unyielding. Even the gods bowed to its rules. When Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, died on the battlefield, not even his divine parent could intervene. His body was carried off, his soul dispatched, quietly, irrevocably, to Hades. Fate did not bend, not even for Olympus. And here, perhaps, lies the true power of the underworld's rulers. Not in their wealth or their throne, but in their restraint. Hades never rebels. Persephone never abandons her post. They do not flaunt, they do not conquer. They endure. In a pantheon filled with drama, they remain silent and eternal. It's rather elegant in its own way. Most gods demand attention. Hades and Persephone ask only to be remembered. So the next time you hear the rustle of wind through dry leaves, or feel the hush of winter settling over the earth, you might think of them, the quiet king and the queen who returns. They are not here to punish. They are here to remind that everything ends, that everything returns. And somewhere in the dark beneath the earth, they are waiting, not with malice, but with certainty. Now, let us leave their shadowed court behind, for in our next descent, we'll meet the judges of the dead themselves, and explore how morality, memory, and myth intertwine in the soul's final trial. Just be sure to bring your best defense. If you thought death in ancient Greece meant a simple fade to black, think again. The Greeks had a deep fondness for formality, and the afterlife was no exception. Once you'd been ferried across the river, nodded politely at the three-headed dog, and stepped into the shadowed halls of Hades, there was one final obstacle to overcome: judgment. Because even in death, there's paperwork. Welcome, then, to the tribunal of the dead, presided over not by gods, but by three rather serious-looking mortals who had earned, through various deeds in life, the eternal privilege of sorting souls like celestial customs officers. Their names were Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. Collectively, they judged every soul that entered the underworld. Individually, well, they each brought their own flavour to the court. Let's begin with Minos, former king of Crete, builder of labyrinths, wrangler of minotaurs. The myths describe him as wise, fair, and occasionally terrifying. In life, he was something of a mixed bag, prone to wrath, but fond of justice. In death, he was promoted to the highest bench, chief judge, robed in dignity, always frowning. He wasn't alone, of course. Rhadamanthus, his brother, was renowned for his unwavering honesty and incorruptible nature, qualities that, then as now, often made someone utterly exhausting at parties. He was assigned the souls of Easterners, Greeks from Asia Minor and the islands, and is said to have judged with a kind of moral purity that brooked no excuses. If you were a trickster, or even vaguely smug, Rhadamanthus likely sent you packing. And then there was Aeacus, ruler of the island of Aegina in life, and in death, the judge of those from the Western world, especially mainland Greeks. Aeacus had a rather impressive resume, even by mythological standards. He'd helped build the walls of Troy with Poseidon and Apollo, and was famed for his piety. Not a man to cross lightly. The idea of 3 judges comes not just from myth, but from the Greeks' own legal culture. The city-states of Greece often used citizen juries to determine guilt, and the notion that the dead too would be weighed and questioned was entirely in keeping with the social order. Death, it seems, was simply another court date, only this one was final. Of course, there was no cross-examination, no witty lawyers in togas. Your life was your testimony, your deeds, your defence. What counted as virtue? The Greeks had opinions. Civic duty, honour in battle, respect for the gods, hospitality, generosity, and an avoidance of hubris, that ever-present sin of overstepping one's mortal place. The punishment for hubris, you'll recall, was rarely a slap on the wrist. It was usually more creative. Eternal hunger, unreachable water, rolling a boulder forever. In many cases, the worst offenders were sent to Tartarus, a kind of maximum security wing for moral degenerates. But for most, the process was less theatrical. The average soul, upon arrival, would be judged and sent to one of 3 places. Asphodel for the neither here nor there crowd, Elysium for the righteous, Tartarus for the truly wicked. It was not a precise theology. The Greeks were more poetic than prescriptive, but it worked. People behaved better when they believed someone was keeping score, even posthumously. Interestingly, the process wasn't just moral. Memory played a role. In Orphic belief, those mystery cults that sprung up in later centuries, the soul's memory was a key component of judgment. The Orphics taught that most people drank from Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and wandered asphodel in dreamy amnesia. But the wise drank instead from Mnemosyne, the river of memory. They remembered who they were, what they had done, and, crucially, how to escape the cycle. For the Orphics believed in reincarnation, not eternal rest, but repeated trials. The soul, if it failed to achieve purity, would be reborn again and again, a cosmic loop of mortality until it finally earned release. The judges in this system were not simply clocks. They were gatekeepers to higher truths. Your judgment might determine not where you rested, but where you started next. This idea likely had Eastern influences. India and Persia had long traditions of cyclical rebirth, but it blended neatly with Greek notions of fate, character, and consequence, and it raised the stakes. Death was not the end. It was a checkpoint. Let's turn for a moment to a few notable defendants. First, Sisyphus, king, trickster, and possibly the most annoying man in mythology. He cheated death twice, mocked the gods, tied up Thanatos, the personification of death itself. When he finally died properly, the judges did not bother with subtlety. He was sentenced to push a boulder uphill for eternity, a task so famously pointless that it's now a metaphor for modern email. Then there's Tantalus, who thought it would be clever to serve his own son at a banquet for the gods. Unsurprisingly, this did not go over well. His punishment? To stand in a pool of water beneath a tree of fruit, both forever just out of reach. Hunger and thirst without end, despite being surrounded by abundance. A sort of divine irony. The judges were fond of those. Ixion, meanwhile, tried to seduce Hera. Not a bright idea. Zeus bound him to a flaming spinning wheel for eternity. Again, the punishment fits the crime. Desire unfulfilled, motion without progress. These examples weren't just stories for entertainment, they were moral instruction. The Greeks used myth to teach what not to do, especially when dealing with family, hospitality, or divine beings with trust issues. Now, one might ask, how fair were the judges? Did they ever make mistakes? Did they quarrel? The myths are oddly silent on this. Perhaps because the Greeks, for all their skepticism, wanted the underworld to feel consistent. Life was chaotic enough. Let death be orderly. It's worth noting that this entire system, rivers, judges, punishments, was not universal across all of Greece. Local beliefs varied. The Homeric vision of the afterlife, for example, was bleaker. In the Odyssey, the dead are little more than shadows. Even mighty Achilles says he'd rather be a poor farmer alive than a dead king. The later, more structured version of the underworld, with judges and options, reflects a cultural shift toward hope, or at the very least, structure. Philosophers played a role in this evolution. Plato, in particular, loved the idea of posthumous judgment. In his dialogue, Phaedo, Socrates waxes lyrical about the soul's journey. In the Republic, we find the myth of Air, a soldier who dies, sees the workings of the afterlife, and returns to tell the tale. In Air's vision, souls choose their next lives based on their past deeds. It's a mix of free will and consequence, laced with poetic justice. Plato's point is clear. How you live matters. Not because a god is watching, but because reality itself keeps score. That idea that there is an order to the universe and that death is not the end but the audit, and are stuck. It influenced not only later Greek thought, but Roman religion, early Christian eschatology, and even Renaissance notions of cosmic justice. So what does it all mean? That the Greeks, even in death, sought meaning. They didn't need fire and brimstone, they had form and function. The underworld was not a nightmare, it was a reflection. You saw yourself there, stripped of status, excuse, and ornament. The judges in this view weren't tyrants. They were mirrors, fair, firm, and eternal. And perhaps that's why the Greek underworld endures. It wasn't a place of horror, but of memory, of consequence. A reminder that every choice, every action, ripples beyond the grave. Of course, if that all sounds a bit too serious, you could always be buried with a second coin, just in case you want to appeal the verdict. Now then, shall we continue our descent? We've met the rulers. We've stood before the judges. In the next chapter, we take to the waters, the 5 rivers of the underworld, each more poetic and unpleasant than the last. Bring sturdy boots and maybe a towel. The Greeks, being who they were, never let a good story get in the way of a practical detail, even in death. And so, when they imagined the underworld, they didn't picture a vague, empty abyss. They envisioned a terrain, a map, a landscape with rivers. 5 of them, to be precise. Each one a symbol, each one a passage. No mere trickling brooks, these. They were the arteries of death itself. Let's begin with the most infamous of them all, Styx. The name alone has a certain weight, harsh, unforgiving, like something you'd name a particularly ill-tempered goat. But in Greek mythology, Styx was the river of hatred, the black current that encircled the underworld 7 times over. It wasn't just a river you crossed, it was one you swore upon. Even the gods feared it. Zeus himself honoured oaths made by the Styx. If a god lied while invoking her name, they weren't simply frowned at. No, They were cast into a year-long coma, followed by 9 years of exile from Olympus. That's nearly a decade of divine silence, which for someone like Hermes must have been agony. The goddess Styx, yes, she was a deity as well as a river, was the daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, and the first to side with Zeus in the great war against the Titans. In gratitude, he granted her river the highest honour, the foundation of truth. All oaths sworn upon it were binding. Mortals had the fates. Gods had the Styx. Now if Styx is the river of hatred, then Acheron is the river of sorrow. Its name means woe or pain, and it served as the main crossing point into the underworld. This was the river that the newly dead approached first. At its banks waited Charon, the ever-grumpy ferryman, demanding his coin, an obol tucked beneath the tongue or placed on the eyes during burial. A small price for passage into eternity. Acheron was a river in both myth and, amusingly, geography. There is an actual Acheron river in northwestern Greece, and ancient people believed it to be a literal entrance to the underworld. You can visit it today, though no one recommends trying to pay the ferryman. Philosophically, Acheron represents the grief of death itself. The crossing is not merely physical, it's emotional. You leave behind the world, your family, your name. The water is not for cleansing, it's for severing. And then we come to Phlegethon, the river of fire. Not metaphorical fire, mind you. Flaming torrents, blazing, ever-burning streams that snake through the most dismal part of the underworld, Tartarus. If you've ever had a holiday go wrong involving lava, you're already familiar with the general vibe. Phlegethon was, quite literally, hellfire. It didn't just burn, it scorched the very concept of hope. Virgil in the Aeneid described its red-hot flood as hissing and moaning like boiling blood. Charming. In some versions of myth, it even joined the Styx, hatred and fire mingling together, which sounds rather like a family reunion in certain households. In later thought, especially Roman and Christian interpretations, Phlegethon became associated with punishment, a precursor to the lakes of fire in more familiar models of hell. But in the Greek world, it was less about sin and more about the presence of divine judgment. You didn't fall into Phlegethon because you were naughty. You fell in because the gods had lost patience with you. Cocytus, by contrast, was the river of wailing, a slow, mournful stream that twisted its way through the more desolate reaches of Hades. It was fed, so the poets said, by the tears of the damned, though one suspects that's more poetic metaphor than hydrological science. Still, it served a clear function. It reminded the soul of what it had lost. If Acheron is the grief of leaving life, Cocytus is the grief of what you've done with it. Some sources place Cocytus in the outer reaches of the underworld, where the souls of those who refused proper burial or died in disgrace drifted in endless lamentation. Forgotten, unclaimed. Even the name is unpleasant. Cocytus. It sticks in the throat like a sob. Fitting, really. And now we come to Lethe, perhaps the most beguiling river of all, the river of forgetfulness. To drink from Lethe was to forget everything. Your name, your life, your choices, your shame. It was the great eraser, the final mercy, or the final theft, depending on how one viewed it. In most traditions, all souls drank from Lethe before entering the asphodel meadows. It dulled the senses, softened the blow, and reduced the sting of death to a dreamlike haze. You wandered as a shadow, unaware that you had ever been anything else. But the Orphics, those mysterious sectarians who viewed life as a trap and death as a test, had a different view. They warned against drinking from Lethe. They taught their initiates to seek out Mnemosyne, the river of memory, instead. They buried their dead with tiny tablets engraved with instructions. Do not drink from Lethe. Drink from the pool of Mnemosyne. Remember who you are. Escape the cycle. Wake up. This alternative cosmology reveals a striking tension in Greek thought. Is forgetting a kindness or a curse? Is memory the path to salvation, or a burden we are lucky to lose? The mainstream myths suggest that peace lies in forgetting. The Orphics suggest that peace lies in remembering. Either way, the soul must choose, or be chosen. These 5 rivers weren't just scenic backdrops. They were psychological states. Sorrow, rage, forgetfulness, fire and lament. Together they formed a symbolic journey, one that mirrored the stages of mourning, or perhaps the steps of spiritual transformation. You did not simply die. You crossed rivers. You passed through sorrow. You forgot. You burned. You wept. Only then did you arrive. It's worth remembering that the Underworld, for all its drama, was less about punishment than transition. These rivers weren't obstacles. They were elements of change. Death was not a door. It was a river delta. Every path split and flowed and rejoined in mysterious ways. In art and literature, the rivers appear frequently. In the Odyssey, Odysseus must summon the dead near the Acheron. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates describes the great chasms of the earth into which these rivers fall. In Roman epic, the influence persists. Aeneas must navigate these same waters, guided by the Sibyl in his journey through the underworld. Even Dante, in his Inferno, borrowed the names, though he twisted their meanings to fit a new theological framework. Phlegethon becomes a boiling river of blood for murderers. Cocytus is a frozen lake of treachery. The Greek subtlety is gone, replaced by moral bookkeeping. But the names endure, and so too do the metaphors. We still speak of crossing rivers, of burning bridges, of drinking to forget. These ancient currents flow into our language, our imagination, our dreams. The Greeks didn't just map the afterlife. They mapped the inner life with rivers that reflected the soul's passage more accurately than any chart or compass. Today, one might be tempted to dismiss these as quaint fables, dusty footnotes in a forgotten religion. But think of how we still talk about loss. Grief comes in waves. Memory flows, sorrow pools, fire consumes. The metaphors have never left us. The rivers are still there. So when your own days feel like wandering between banks, when you wade through sadness, or forget your purpose, or burn with regret, you are, in a sense, walking old paths. You are retracing ancient watercourses. You are remembering what the Greeks already knew, that death is not a moment. It is a journey. And the soul, like a leaf on the current, drifts slowly into something deeper. And in the next chapter, we'll meet the ferryman who starts it all. Charon, keeper of the crossing. Just don't forget your coin. He's terribly fussy about that. By now, you've died. You've descended. You've passed judgment. You've crossed, at least metaphorically, a number of troubling rivers. And just before you truly enter the realm of the dead, there's one more figure standing between you and the next stage of your existence. He doesn't smile. He doesn't ask how your journey was. He's not even particularly chatty. This is Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, the man with the boat, and the world's most stubborn coin policy. Charon, whose name means something between fierce brightness and keen gaze, depending on how poetic your ancient Greek is one of the most iconic figures of the underworld. And rightly so. He's the first employee you meet. Less a greeter, more a gatekeeper, and absolutely allergic to small talk. His job is simple: ferry the newly dead across the river Acheron, or in some versions the Styx, and deposit them on the shores of Hades' kingdom. It sounds mundane until you realise he's been doing this job without a single day off since the dawn of human death. No wonder he's cranky. But before we get too deep into his performance review, let's talk logistics. In order to gain passage on Charon's boat, you need to have been buried properly, which in ancient Greek terms meant more than just digging a hole. The dead had to be prepared with rites, prayers, and most importantly, a coin. An obol, a small silver or bronze piece placed under the tongue or on the eyes. This wasn't symbolic, this was fair. And Charon, for all his glowering silence, did not run a charity. Without payment, the soul was denied boarding. No exceptions. You'd be forced to wait indefinitely on the shores. A ghostly backlog of unpaid passengers. In Homer's Odyssey, such souls wander, forgotten and unclaimed, murmuring like wind through reeds. Not punished exactly, just stuck. Which, arguably, is worse. This is why, across the Greek world, burial customs were taken so seriously. To die without one was a kind of spiritual homelessness. Even enemies were sometimes buried out of sheer fear of divine retaliation. Leaving a corpse unburied was not just an insult, it was a curse. It invited hauntings, plagues, and all manner of civic inconvenience. The dead were expected to behave, but only if the living did their part first. Charon, then, became more than just a mythological boatman. He was a symbol of transition and of obligation. He stood for the idea that death had terms, and if those terms weren't met, the dead suffered a slow, bureaucratic purgatory, not because they were evil, simply because they weren't processed. Now, visually speaking, Charon evolved quite a bit. In early Greek vase paintings, he's a ragged old man with a hood, a heavy beard, and a long pole. Practical, unsentimental. The kind of fellow who looks like he's been commuting the same route since before Prometheus stole fire. Later, Roman interpretations turned him more skeletal and monstrous. Gaunt, grim, with hollow eyes and hollow cheeks. The prototype for our modern Grim Reaper. But the Greeks preferred their Charon weary, not wicked. He was never depicted as evil. He didn't torture. He didn't judge. He simply performed his duty with the kind of grim professionalism you might expect from a career tax auditor or an underpaid museum guard. He shows up in vase art, solemn and unsmiling, greeting Hermes as he delivers yet another batch of souls. The two rarely chat. There is, after all, work to be done. Even the gods seem to leave him alone. Hades didn't micromanage, and Hermes just dropped the souls off at the terminal like a supernatural delivery driver. Charon got them across. No fuss, no glory. Charon's boat, interestingly, was never described in much detail. The Greeks weren't terribly concerned with nautical specs. There are no poetic flourishes about carved wood or sails woven by nymphs. What mattered was the crossing, that brief, irreversible journey from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The boat was not a vehicle, it was a moment. And moments, in Greek mythology, always matter. In some tales, Charon appears beyond his usual role. During Heracles' 12th labour, the fetching of Cerberus from the underworld, the hero, very much alive, demands passage. Charon, to his credit, refuses, but Heracles, being Heracles, persuades him in the usual Greek heroic fashion, with fists. The ferryman is roughed up, the hero crosses, and as punishment, Charon is imprisoned for a year. You can imagine his union rep had a field day. Another famous visitor is Orpheus, who charms Charon not with strength, but with song. His music, so heartbreakingly beautiful, softens even the ferryman's crusty heart, and he allows Orpheus to pass in search of Eurydice. It's a rare moment of leniency, or possibly just a welcome break from centuries of silence. Then there's Aeneas, the Roman hero, who approaches Charon in Virgil's Aeneid. When the ferryman sees him, alive, with a sword and shield, he scoffs. "No living man crosses here," he says, in so many Latin words. But when Aeneas produces the golden bow, a sort of divine hall pass, Charon mutters, grumbles, and waves him aboard. He doesn't like it, but rules are rules. These stories reveal something crucial. Charon is not cruel. He's lawful. He obeys the order of things. He respects the boundaries between life and death. And when those boundaries are broken, even by heroes, even by fate, he does not rejoice. He winces. Because really, it's just more work for him. In Greek tragedy and philosophy, Charon looms large. He is not a personification of death, that would be Thanatos, but rather its administrator. He doesn't come for you. He waits, always waiting, a shadow by the shore. He became so iconic that his name and his crossing entered common expression. The fare to Charon was a phrase for death itself. Poets described their characters as boarding the boat or handing over the obol. The metaphor was so entrenched that even centuries later, in Christian and Islamic lore, echoes of the ferryman persist. There's even archaeological evidence of his importance. Excavations across the Greek world, from Attica to Sicily, have uncovered graves with coins purposefully placed in mouths. Inscriptions on Orphic tablets speak directly to Charon. "Tell him I am a child of earth and starry heaven. Let me pass." Even in death, it seems, there was protocol. And in a way, Charon's presence raises deep questions. If you must pay to enter the next world, what does that say about justice? About economy? About legacy? The Greeks weren't sure. But they knew one thing. Death had structure. You didn't just vanish. You queued, you waited, and when your time came, you climbed aboard. There's also something slightly comedic about him. Here is a man, assuming we can call him that, who has had the same job for all eternity, who meets millions of souls and says nothing, who rows in silence, always forward, never back, who never once takes a wrong turn, who has probably, at some point, cursed every philosopher, hero and singer who tried to sneak in under special terms. Some versions of the myth even hint that Charon once had a temple of his own, a minor shrine in a forgotten village, or perhaps just a quiet offering placed on a dock. A crust of bread, a coin, a whisper. Not because people loved him, but because they respected him. Because they hoped one day when they met him, he might not be in one of his moods. And yet, for all his gruffness, he's essential. Charon is the transition, the moment of crossing, the boundary made visible. The Greeks didn't picture death as a fall or a door, but a journey. And every journey needs a boatman. So if you ever find yourself on a misty riverbank, staring into dark waters, and you see a hunched figure waiting with a pole, be respectful. be ready. And for heaven's sake, have exact change. Because no matter how brave you are, no matter how wise, how famous, how prepared, no one rides for free. Now that we've crossed into the underworld, met its rulers, judges, rivers, and ferrymen, it's time to turn our gaze deeper still. In the next chapter, we meet the heroes who defied death, who descended into this realm while still breathing, and sometimes made it back again. They are not many, but their stories still echo in the dark. For most mortals, death was a one-way journey. You lived, you died, you paid your coin to Karen, and you moved on, with varying degrees of dignity depending on how you'd behaved above ground. But there were a few notable exceptions. Mortals who stepped across the boundary without waiting for death to claim them, who descended into the underworld alive and, more miraculously, came back. Not ghosts, not souls, but breathing bodies in a place that didn't welcome breath. These are the katabasis stories, from the Greek word katabasis, meaning descent. In myth, they're always dramatic. In reality, well, if one believes in such things, likely traumatic. Yet they offer something rare in Greek thought: a bridge between worlds, a glimpse into the realm of the dead, filtered through the eyes of the living. Let's begin with one of the most famous. Orpheus, son of the muse Calliope, and by all accounts the finest musician in the ancient world. Orpheus didn't wield a sword, he didn't slay monsters, he played the lyre, and when he did, even stones wept. His music could calm storms, charm animals, and as it turns out, briefly rearrange the rules of life and death. When his wife Eurydice died, a serpent bite, as always in myth, Orpheus was inconsolable. But rather than curse the gods or tear his robes, he did something far more unsettling. He walked into the underworld. No army, no trickery. Just a man and a lyre, stepping past the gates of Hades as if he had an appointment. And incredibly, the underworld listened. Cerberus laid down his many heads. The Furies, normally immune to sentiment, stopped gnashing their teeth. Even Hades and Persephone, notoriously unmoved by mortal pleas, found themselves blinking back a tear or two. Orpheus asked for one thing: Eurydice returned to life. He didn't beg. He sang. The rulers agreed, with one condition: Eurydice would follow him back, but he must not look back at her until they reached the upper world. If he turned, even for a moment, she would be lost. And so he walked, step by step, through the blackness. Her footsteps behind him, faint, but there. He reached the surface, saw the sunlight rise, and turned, just before she crossed. One glance, and she was gone, this time forever. The myth, of course, is tragic, but it speaks to a deeper idea, that death is not only final, but perilously delicate. Even love, even art, can't defy it fully. And Orpheus, for all his gifts, forgot that the rules below are not like those above. Now, if Orpheus's journey is poetic, Heracles is muscular. His katabasis was one of his 12 labours, to descend into Hades and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound, alive and uninjured. Why? Well, because King Eurystheus, who issued the labours, was running out of ideas. And perhaps because even a petty king enjoys seeing a demigod squirm. Heracles prepared carefully. He was nothing if not methodical in his violence. He sought the help of Hermes and Athena, was purified in Eleusis, and then marched boldly down into the realm of the dead. No lyre, no tears. Just brute force and a lion-skin cloak. He asked Hades politely for Cerberus. Hades, perhaps bemused, agreed, on the condition that Heracles subdue the beast without weapons. Heracles, never one to shy away from a challenge involving wrestling something with too many heads, tackled Cerberus with his bare hands, wrestled him into submission, and dragged him snarling back to the surface. It was not an act of love. It was not tragic. But it was the sort of heroism the Greeks admired. Raw, unapologetic, and practical. Heracles didn't conquer death, but he manhandled its guardian, and that was close enough. Then there's Theseus, who, along with his slightly less intelligent friend, Pirithous, also tried to enter the underworld. Their goal? Kidnap Persephone, the queen of the dead, and make her Pirithous' bride. Now this was not a plan born of brilliance. Hades, upon meeting the two heroes, smiled, which, given the context, should have been a warning. He invited them to sit. They did, and immediately found themselves fused to their seats, physically stuck, bound by magic, perhaps even fate. They remained that way, eternally immobilized on the so-called chair of forgetfulness, until Heracles, during his own catabasis, found them and managed to free Theseus. Pirithous, however, was left behind. The gods were not keen on rescuing someone whose great ambition was to seduce the wife of death. The tale is instructive. Don't mess with the queen of the underworld, and never go adventuring with a friend who has ideas above his mythological station. One of the most haunting catabasis stories, though, is found in Homer's Odyssey. In Book 11, Odysseus is told to seek prophecy from the dead, specifically from the blind seer Tiresias. To do so, he sails to the edge of the world and performs a ritual, digging a trench, pouring libations of honey, milk, wine, and blood, and calling forth the spirits of the dead. And they come, in droves. Not just Tiresias, but warriors, queens, mothers, lost shipmates. Even Achilles, who declares mournfully that he would rather be a poor man alive than a king among the dead. It's a chilling thought. The hero of heroes, reduced to longing for the smallest pleasures of life. Odysseus doesn't walk into the underworld. He stands at its edge, but what he sees leaves him shaken. The dead do not sleep peacefully. They hunger. They crowd. They long for remembrance. The journey is not a triumph. It's a reckoning. These catabasis tales serve several purposes. They are, first and foremost, dramatic. The living walking among the dead has a certain flair, but they also reinforce core ideas of Greek thought, that the underworld is not a place for the living, that its laws are absolute, and that those who defy them rarely emerge unscathed. And yet, the very fact that these stories exist, that mortals did descend and return, suggests something hopeful. A crack in the stone. A thread of possibility. Death is final, yes, but not always impenetrable. Later traditions would expand on this. In Roman myth, Aeneas doesn't just visit the dead. He meets his father, receives wisdom, and sees the souls of future Romans waiting to be born. For Virgil, the underworld is not only memory, but prophecy. In the Orphic Mysteries, the soul descends not once, but many times, through lifetimes, seeking purification. Their catabasis is not a single heroic feat, but a spiritual map. The soul falls, forgets, remembers, and returns until it finds release. Their heroes are not warriors, but initiates. These stories influenced everything that came after. Dante's Inferno, with its guided tour through hell, is one long catabasis. Christ's descent into the underworld in Christian tradition echoes the same structure. Even modern literature borrows the trope. The hero, who must descend into darkness, face death, and come back changed. In all these tales, the descent is not punishment, it's transformation. And perhaps that's what the Greeks understood best, that to face death, to look into it, walk beside it, and still return, is the greatest knowledge of all. The hero doesn't conquer death, he survives it. He sees its rules, and he learns how to live differently. So whether one carries a lyre, a club, or a coin, the lesson is the same. Those who walk into the underworld must leave something behind, and never return quite the same. In the next chapter, we'll travel deeper than any hero ever dared, to Tartarus, the prison beneath even Hades. A place not for mortals, but for monsters, titans, and those who